So we're on the top of Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, 4 lines down from the top. My Tavra. What are we talking about? Blowing the shofar in broken pieces, broken kolos. Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Yehuda, Tavre Bote Ramen. That these tavre, these broken kolos, are going to break the nidui. This is the way that Bezdin will terminate the nidui. The Sanya, as we learned in the Brisa, Omer Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Kol Mokom Shenosnu Chachamim Eineim Omiso Oni. This is the power of the tzaddikim, the chachamim, to create a punishment for people when they set their eyes on a person that could bring about chas v'sholom, a person's death, or at least poverty, because the person who's an ani, the Gemara says, in the Darwin's chachik mace. And now we go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "V'nozir v'mitzora mitum asol l'taros," that the Nazir or the Mitzora, after he completes his process of Tara, he makes the transition from Tuma to Tara. Boy minei Rabbi Yirmiyah mi Rabbi Zera, b'shlo hoya lahem pnai, o dilma af b'shlo hoya lahem pnai. The Mishnah has a special heter for both a Nazir and a Tameh to cut their hair when they are making this transition from Tara to Tumah. Is the Mishnah only allowing this, a special dispensation, to allow the Nazir or the Mitzora to cut their hair because they didn't have a possibility of cutting their hair before Yontif? Or shall we say that even if they did have the opportunity, let's say they became tar not on Yontif itself, but they became tar even before Yontif. They had an opportunity to cut their hair on Chol Moed. And nevertheless, the Mishnah would still allow them to cut their hair on the Moed, on Chol Moed. We're going to determine the law in this case from a Brisa. The entire list of those, like people who got out of jail, or someone who got off a ship from overseas, and the Mishnah allows them to cut their hair on Chol Moed. The rule of the Mishnah and the leniency of allowing cutting your hair on Chol Moed only applies when they did not have the possibility of cutting their hair before Yontif. If, for example, they reached the possibility of Tara before Yontif, so they could have cut their hair before Yontif, Asurim. However, the Brisa continues and says that in the case of Nazir or the case of Mitzora, Afal Pisha Hoyalem Pnai Mutarim, there must be some overriding reason why they were makil, even if the Mitzora or the Nazir could have cut his hair before the Yontif, and he didn't do so. We're not going to punish him. We're going to allow him to cut his hair on Chol Moed. Why? And here's the pushing reason, the logic that compels us. Shelo Yishu Karbanos Seyan. Because both the Mitzora and the Nazir have karbanos that they have to bring when they become tar, but the law is that they cannot bring this karban or their karbanos, respectively, until they cut their hair. So for whatever reason, they didn't cut their hair before Yontif. Now we're going to impose a penalty on them and a punishment on them. And then we're going to say to them, don't cut your hair on Yontif, on Chol Moed. Then as a result, what's going to happen is they can't bring the karbanos, because until they cut their hair, they can't bring karbanos. So in such a case, the Rabbanan waived the penalty that normally would apply to someone who could have cut his hair before Yontif and failed to do so. But in this case, because of the overriding reason, the compelling reason, to guarantee that they bring their karbanos on time, you see from this Gemara that a chiyuv karban, someone who's b'chiyuv karban, should bring his karban at the first opportune moment. So for the sake of punishing him, we're not going to have him violate this requirement and obligation to bring his karban on time. We learned in a brisa, hakohen ve'avel mutar begiluach. Both a kohen and an avel who didn't have a chance to cut the hair before Chol Moed will be allowed to cut the hair on Chol Moed. Now, this brisa, at the face of it, doesn't make any sense because we know that in any case of a person who could not cut his hair before the Moed, for example, in this case, an avel, he's asur begiluach for shloshim yom. So we have two sections of avelus. We have the more severe avelus of 7, and after the 7 days, he goes into shloshim. And even in shloshim, he's enjoined from cutting his hair. So he had no possibility of cutting his hair. Or, for example, the halacha is that with regard to the Anshe Mishmar, they made a takana that they're not allowed to cut their hair during the week of Mishmar to guarantee that they would cut their hair before that. So if that week of their Mishmeretz coincided with the week before Yontif, they didn't have an opportunity to cut their hair before Yontif. Certainly it goes without saying that we're going to allow them to cut their hair on Chol Moed. So the Gemara now wants to clarify exactly what's going on in this brisa. The Mishnah would seem to have established a principle from which we can derive logically the case of Kohen v'Avel, but the Mishnah didn't mention this. Why did the Mishnah ignore it? So on the one hand, it's pshita, it seems to be so logically compelling. And on the other hand, why did the Mishnah omit it? And from the omission, it seems like maybe there's a chumrah in these cases that we're going to prohibit the cutting of the hair. Now, in the note over here, he writes that as a general rule, when it comes to avelus of Shiva and Shloshim, we cancel them when there's a festival. So in this case, where the Yontif came, it should be Mevatel Shiva and Shloshim. So for example, let's say Yontif fell out during Shiva. Then Shloshim is canceled as well as Shiva. However, there is one halacha that if Shloshim didn't begin yet, because Shloshim begins after Shiva, then the halacha is different. Then the Yontif will not be Mevatel Shloshim, but rather he'll start Shloshim after Yontif, but he calculates even the days of Yontif as part of the Shloshim, since both during Yontif and during Shloshim, he is enjoined from cutting his hair and laundering his clothes. So again, Shloshim begins after Shiva, and we're going to have machlokas later on about this between Abba Shaul and Chachamim. When does Shiva pass into Shloshim? It could be that Shiva lasts for a full 7 days, and then we start Shloshim. Or another opinion is that part of the day is like the whole day, which is called Mitzvah Sayom Kekula. So on the 7th day of Shiva, we can already count that day as the first day of Shloshim because Shiva terminates in the morning through the halacha of Mitzvah Sayom Kekula. What's the case of this Avel that we allow in the brisa for him to cut his hair during the Moed? If we're talking about a case in which he went through all of Shiva, completed Shiva, and he's up to day 8, which is the beginning of Shloshim. And day 8, in this case, coincided with Erev Yontif. So the Gemara asks the following question: why are you telling me that he couldn't have taken a haircut because of Avelus? He could have cut his hair on Erev Yontif, and therefore, if he neglected to do so, then how can we allow him a leniency to cut his hair? He neglected to cut his hair. Why should he be allowed to cut his hair on Yontif, on Chol Moed? So the 8th day of his Avelus coincides with Shabbos, which in turn coincides with Erev Yontif. And the Gemara thinks in such a case, Boile Ligaluche Erev Shabbos. It's Erev Shabbos, the 8th day of his Avelus. It's Erev Yontif. He should have cut his hair once again, as we said earlier, on day number 8, on Erev Shabbos, which is Erev Yontif. Yom Rav Chizda Ravina Bar Shilo, Halacha ke Amashol, we ask in Mixas Hayom Kekulo. And therefore, he could have cut his hair on day 7 in honor of Yontif, because already after the morning of day 7, even an hour of day 7, we pass in that he's completed his Shiva. Umodim Chacham Lavashol, Shechal Shmini Shalolios B'Shabbos Erev Haregel. And the Brisa records that even the Chachamim who rejected Mixas Hayom Kekulo on the 7th day of Avelus, but in the case in which the 7th day of Avelus coincided with Erev Yontif, Erev Shabbos, and now the 8th day is on Shabbos Erev Yontif, that Mutar L'Galeach the Erev Shabbos. We're going to allow him to cut his hair on Friday in honor of Yontif. Once again, if he's allowed to cut his hair before Yontif and he failed to do so, then why should we make an exception to the rule and allow him to cut his hair on Chol Moed when he could have cut his hair on Erev Yontif, even according to the Chachamim? Because here's the case where Shmini Shalom was on Erev Shabbos, Erev Yontif. Lo tzrichi, but what's the case? Shechal Shvi Shalom Lios B'Shabbos Erev Haregel. We go back to the original premise that the last day of his Avelus, the day in which there's a machlokes between Abba Shalom and Chachamim as to whether or not we can apply the principle of Mixas Hayom Kekulo. And that falls out on Shabbos, which is Erev Haregel. So in this case, the Brisa is offering a leniency, and we're talking about this case itself, where, as we said before, the 7th day of his Avelus, the end of his Shiva, is on Shabbos, which is Erev Haregel. And now we can begin to understand the Brisos. Tana Bara, the Tana of the Brisa, Bara means Brisa, accepted the principle of Abashol as far as the 7th day of Avelus, the Yom of Mixas Hayom Kekulo. Therefore, Yom HaShvi, Ololo, Lekanu, Lekan, the 7th day of his Avelus is both the last day of Shiva and the first day of Shloshim. That means that his Shloshim, according to Abashol, would have begun on Erev Yontif, which means that Yontif itself comes along as Bevatel Shloshim. And therefore, again, he could have cut his hair on Erev Yontif. Again, let's go over the logic here. We're holding now like Abashol Mixas Hayom Kekulo. The 7th day of his Avelus was on Shabbos, and that's Erev Yontif. So in such a case, even if we assume like Abashol, it's not going to help you at all, because Abashol holds Mixas Hayom Kekulo, and after the 7th day of Avelus, it's the first day of Shloshim, and Yontif is Gimivatel his Shloshim. Now you'll say, well, he couldn't have taken a haircut on that 7th day because it was Shabbos. You don't cut your hair on Shabbos. So the Gemara answers, came on the Shabbos Hava Onus. Since it was Shabbos, he's in a situation of mitigating circumstance where it was impossible for him to cut his hair on Erev Yontif because Erev Yontif was Shabbos. And that's why the Bryce allows you to cut your hair on Chol Moed. But our Mishnah omits any mention in this case of an Avel. Why? Because our Mishnah reflects the Shita Chacham to the Amri Lo Amrin of Mixas Hayom Kekulo. They never accepted this principle of Mixas Hayom Kekulo. And therefore, the 7th day of Avelus has to be an entire day from beginning to end. Vakati Lo Sholim Avelus de Shiva. The morning of the 7th day is not considered the termination of Shiva. He has to wait till the end of the day. And therefore, Shloshim was not subject to bittul on Yontif, because when he went from Shiva to Shloshim, it was already that Shabbos, right? Because that Shabbos itself is going to be a full day of Avelus of Shiva, and therefore Shloshim could only start the next day, and it's already Yontif. Yontif could only be Mavatal Shiva or Shloshim when you had Shiva or Shloshim before Yontif. So therefore, Shloshim is not canceled by Yontif. So even if Erev Yontif would have been on a weekday, he would not be allowed to cut his hair. You cannot say that he was prevented from cutting his hair because of Shabbos, and therefore we're not going to allow him to cut his hair on the moment. You might ask, what about High Kohen? You had a case not only of an Ovil, but also of a Kohen, and the Brisa had a special leniency to allow the Kohen, who's one of the Anshe Mishmar, to cut his hair on Chol Hamoed during his Mishmar. Maybe you'll say that he already concluded his 7-day Mishmar period on Erev Yontif. Now, if that be the case, then how can you give him a leniency to cut his hair on Chol Hamoed? He boiled the Erev Haregel. He should have on Erev Yontif cut his hair. So we're not going to make an allowance for him if he neglected cutting his hair when he could have done so. He concluded his Mishmeres week on Yontif, in the middle of Yontif on Chol Hamoed. And in such a case, he could not have taken his haircut before that because it was Yontif, it was regular. Tana Dinan Savar, our Tana maintains the position that came on Disnan. We learned in a Mishnah Masechet Pesukah, which Shloshim Prakim Bashana Hoyulo Hoyukol HaMishmaros Shavos. There were 3 periods of time, all the regalim of Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, where all the Mishmaros are equal, and therefore it means all 24 Mishmaros have the same din. Be'emurei ha'regalim u'bechiluk lechem hapanim, as far as the emurim, which are divided up amongst the kohanim of Yontif, karbanos, or as far as dividing up the lechem hapanim, which is divvied up amongst the Anshe Mishmar of the kohanim. Here, during the 3 regalim, all the Anshe Mishmar are equal, they're all on the same footing. Kiman de lo shalom mishmar to beregeltam. So if that be the case, it's to be considered as if he didn't complete his mishmeres on Yontif, but he continued until the close of Yontif. But the Tana the Brisa that we learned is he's of the opinion the Afal Gav the Shayach Bahanach Mishmaros, even though he's connected together with all the Mishmaros that are equal in Kulam Shavos, Mishmarto Mia Shlimolek. His own Mishmeres ended on Yontif. And because of that, we're going to allow him in the Brisa to cut his hair on Chol Hamoed. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa, Kol Elu Sha'omru Mutarim L'Galech B'Moed, Mutarim L'Galech B'Nei Ha'eflon. Whenever there's a heter, for special circumstances, to cut your hair on Chol Hamoed, then ipso facto, you're allowed to cut your hair on during Avelus. We don't know which Avelus we're talking about. Are we talking about Shiva or are we talking about Shloshim? For Tanya Asurim, we have another Brisa that says they're not allowed to cut their hair in Avelus because Avelus is more chamor than Chol Hamoed. Amar Rav Chizda, Amar Rav Shilo, Ki Tanya Hacha. This Brisa that we started with, that established that you're allowed to cut your hair during the Avelus, whenever you're allowed to cut your hair during Chol Hamoed, Mutarim, is Bishetakfu Avela. He went from one Avelus straight into another Avelus. In other words, while he was in Shiva, another one of his relatives died, and now he has a very long period of Avelus. And he never had an opportunity to cut his hair before the first period of Avelus, and now he has a second period of Avelus. Here the Rabbanan are going to be makil and give him an allowance to be matir, cutting his hair during the second mourning period. So the Gemara asks, Ibisha Takfu Avela of my area called Elu Sha'amru, is afilu kuli al minami. Why do you have to specify if the case is that there are mourning periods in succession, one overlaps with the other? So why are you telling me that anyone who's allowed to cut his hair on Chol Hamoed, we have this heter during Avelus? Well, the truth is that if he didn't have an opportunity before the second Avelus to cut his hair, as Afilu Kuli Almalo, anyone could cut his hair during Avelus if he has that situation. The Sanya Takfu Avelus Zachar Zeh, Hichbit Siaro is Mekel Betar, Machabis Susa B'Mayim. If he goes from one Avelus into a second Avelus, and the two overlap, and his hair becomes very heavy on his head, then he's allowed to cut it with a razor. We'll soon see why he's allowed to cut it with a razor and not with the scissors. And he's allowed to wash his ksus, his garment, not in the normal washing machine where you put detergent and so forth. You could only use water. In any event, right now the Gemara thinks that we have a general heter for someone who's takfu avelov, and the Gemara's question now comes back to haunt us, my area called elusha amru. And if it's a case of takfu avelov, why did the Bryce have to single out people about whom Chazal say they could cut their hair on Chol Moed? Because they had no opportunity to cut their hair before in this case, before their Avelus. So the Gemara answers, the Bryce is telling us that although he's allowed to cut his hair, in the case of Takfu Avelov, he needs a shinu. He has to do it in an unusual way. He has to cut his hair with a razor, not with scissors. And likewise, when we allow him to wash his garment, he's going to have to do it the shinui, not in the normal way, with different kinds of detergents that are called nasar or ohel. So we have now the first brisa, and that teaches us Rav Chisda's distinction in the case of takfu avelus, where one avelus occurs in succession after the other avelus. And that's Rav Chisda's requirement in such a case of a shinui in giluach and a shinui in kibbutz. But let's say we have another overlap of, let's say he was a Yotzim Beis Hasurim, or he was Yared Misfinoso Bayam, and again, he didn't have an opportunity to cut his hair or to wash his clothing because he was in that state of being jailed, etc. So then, after the first Avelus passed, he can cut his hair, kidarko, with the scissors, or wash his clothing with detergent in the normal way. So if it's takfu avelus, then we go back to the first avelus and we analyze whether he could have taken a haircut before the first avelus. And if he was getting out of jail at that time, so that means that before the avelus he did not have the opportunity to take a haircut, then we're going to allow him to take a haircut without a shinu. But if it's only takfu aveluso, the overlap of one avelus on the other, and he could have cut his hair before the first Avelus began, then we're going to limit the heter. We're only going to allow him to take a haircut during Avelus if he uses a razor and he can launder his clothes with water without any detergents. Amar Rav Chisda, Zolsomeres, Avel Aser B'tichboses. We see clearly from this brisa, you're not allowed to wash your clothing during Avelus. And the reason for that is because of what we call hesech hadas, that the halacha requires you during the avelus to be totally single-mindedly focused on the avelus and not to be distracted. And if you're involved in laundering your clothing, that's a distraction. And some of the poskim want to say that if you send it out to a launderer, then there's no hesech hadas. Tana Rabbanu, we learned to the brisa, Kishem chamru asur l'galeach b'moed. We're going to now expand the scope of the Easter of taking a haircut on Chol Moed. We'll see how that applies to Avelus as well. Kach, so too. Asur litol tziparnayim b'moed. Now, I'm not sure exactly what he means by tziparnayim. Was he talking about the nails of his fingers, or perhaps the nails of his toes? Let's assume we're talking about the fingernails. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi Mati. Rabbi Yossi was of the opinion, and we'll see that the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, that the prohibition that was instituted by the Chachamim regarding Chol Moed was limited to cutting one's hair, and it did not extend to include cutting one's nails. Rabbi Yossi says that long nails are unsightly. It's like repugnant. And therefore, they never enacted a requirement that would prohibit him from cutting his nails on Chol Moed. Shem shal amru, Avel also galech b'mei evlo, kach also litol tziparnayim b'mei evlo. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi Matin. So we have a second brisa, or perhaps it's the summary of the first brisa, to reiterate what we said before and present the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. Amar ula halachic Rabbi Yehuda be'avel. We have a general rule that whenever Rabbi Yehuda is a dissenting opinion, we pass like him in Hilchas Avel. Halachic Rabbi Yossi b'moed. So it means that we're going to paskin according to Rav, according to Ula, that an Avel is not allowed to cut his nails. We're going to paskin like Rabbi Yossi, that on Chol Moed you're allowed to cut your nails. And Shmuel disagrees, as we'll see momentarily.